Leonard Hayes, 66 years old, was a familiar presence in a neighborhood of Brooklyn, where he had lived on the streets for more than 10 years. Thin and weathered, with a silver beard that hadn't been properly groomed in years, he always carried an old military-style backpack, its once vibrant green canvas now faded, and the straps worn to threads from constant use. Locals knew him as the quiet one, unlike many others who asked for change or caused commotion. Leonard kept to himself, gathering bottles for recycling, sometimes accepting leftover food from kind restaurant workers, and rotating his sleeping spots so he wouldn't become a burden to any particular storefront. What few realized was that Leonard had served in the United States Army for over 2 decades. He was honorably discharged in 2004. After his wife, Evelyn, passed away from cancer in 2008, an illness the VA hospital had tragically misdiagnosed, Leonard spiraled into depression. He refused support from his family, sold his modest home, donated all the proceeds to his late wife's favorite charity, and disappeared into the endless anonymity of New York City. Sometimes it felt easier to become nobody than to live as someone who believed he had failed the one he loved most. He once confided this to a volunteer at a soup kitchen on a bitter November night when the temperature plunged and the first snow threatened the streets. Leonard entered Parker's Corner Market, exhausted from 3 days without food. His hands trembled as he slid an old loaf of bread into his coat, unnoticed by Mr. Parker, who was busy assisting another customer. But new security mirrors caught the act. "Hey, you there, stop!" Mr. Parker yelled, grabbing the phone. "I'm calling the cops!" Leonard didn't flee. He simply stood still, the bread plainly visible inside his half-closed jacket. "I just needed a little strength to survive another day," he murmured. Within minutes, two police officers arrived. The younger of the two, Officer Ramirez, hesitated slightly as he handcuffed Leonard's frail wrists. "Sir, are you really a veteran?" Ramirez asked, noticing the battered chain of dog tags hanging around Leonard's neck. Leonard nodded. "I used to be someone who mattered. Not anymore." "I'm sorry, but I have to arrest you," Ramirez said with genuine regret. "The owner's pressing charges, says this isn't your first time shoplifting." At the precinct, Leonard was treated like any petty criminal. A public defender met with him briefly but seemed more focused on moving cases quickly than understanding the man before him. Leonard was given a court date for the very next morning, where he would face formal charges. At dawn, Leonard was escorted into Brooklyn Municipal Court, still wearing the same rumpled clothes from the previous day after spending a cold night in a cell. No family members sat waiting for him in the audience. No one had come forward to speak on his behalf. Only a handful of attorneys, a few journalists covering more significant cases, and court clerks preoccupied with their usual routines filled the room. Case number 47,293, State versus Leonard Hayes, the clerk announced with mechanical disinterest. A young prosecutor adjusted his tie and spoke. "Your Honor, the defendant was caught stealing bread from a local store. Considering his prior incidents of minor theft and his lack of a permanent address, the state recommends continued detention until trial." The Honorable Judge Samuel Whitaker, a man known for his stern objectivity and quick rulings, barely looked at Leonard as he flipped through the case file. Most in the courtroom had already mentally discarded the matter as just another homeless case passing through the system. "Mr. Hayes, how do you plead?" Judge Whitaker finally asked, glancing up. "Guilty, Your Honor," Leonard answered softly. "I was hungry." A chuckle echoed from the back of the courtroom. The judge shot a sharp look in that direction before returning his attention to the file in front of him. "Leonard Edward Hayes, former Sergeant of the United States Army." The judge's voice faltered slightly as he read the identification. A heavy silence descended over the courtroom as Judge Whitaker's expression changed dramatically. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of his bench. He looked at Leonard, then down at the file again, and then back at Leonard, as if seeing him for the first time. Without any explanation, Judge Whitaker suddenly rose to his feet. The entire courtroom froze in confusion. It was almost unheard of for a judge to stand up during a routine proceeding. For several long, tense moments, Judge Whitaker remained silent, his face a portrait of restrained emotion. "Your Honor?" the prosecutor asked cautiously, uncertain how to proceed after the judge's unexpected action. "The court will recess for 15 minutes, Judge Whitaker announced, his voice unusually rough. The defendant would remain seated. As the judge disappeared into his chambers, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Only Leonard sat motionless, his gaze locked on the floor, either unaware or unconcerned about the strange chain of events his name had just set in motion. What do you think about veterans who served their nation only to find themselves forgotten on the streets? Stay with us to uncover what caused the entire courtroom to stand still. Inside his office, Judge Samuel Whitaker pulled a weathered photograph from the drawer of his desk. A group of soldiers in desert uniforms posed in front of a medical tent in Iraq. His hand trembled slightly as he picked out his younger self in the image, 20 years earlier, working as a field medic before he turned to law. And there, standing in the back row, was Leonard Hayes. The judge powered up his computer and accessed a military database he still had credentials for through his work with Veterans Affairs. Leonard's service record flashed onto the screen, confirming what the judge had feared. Sergeant Leonard Hayes had served 3 tours, 2 in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, focusing on logistics, ensuring supplies reached forward operating bases during some of the bloodiest stretches of both wars. He had earned the Bronze Star for heroism after his convoy was ambushed in 2003. Rather than seeking shelter, Leonard had driven a burning supply truck away from wounded soldiers, sustaining injuries but saving 17 lives in the process. Sergeant Leonard Hayes had served 3 tours, 2 in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, focusing on logistics, ensuring supplies reached forward operating bases during some of the bloodiest stretches of both wars. He had earned the Bronze Star for heroism after his convoy was ambushed in 2003. Rather than seeking shelter, Leonard had driven a burning supply truck away from wounded soldiers, sustaining injuries, but saving 17 lives in the process. Among the documents was a photograph that had once graced the front page of the New York Times. Leonard carrying an injured Afghan child to a medevac helicopter during a humanitarian effort. For a brief time, that photo made him a symbol of compassion amidst chaos, before the world's attention moved elsewhere. But what truly froze Judge Whitaker's breath was a recently declassified mission report from July 2003. In the midst of a frenzied evacuation under enemy fire, Leonard had carried a wounded medic, Private First Class Samuel Whitaker, 2 miles to safety, even while shrapnel wounds tore at his own leg. "My God," the judge whispered, "it's him." For years, Judge Whitaker had tried to find the man who had saved his life, but Leonard had slipped into civilian anonymity after his discharge, leaving no forwarding address. The judge had never known the man's full name. Only the name Hayes shouted across the smoke and gunfire. While the judge struggled to process the revelation, Leonard remained in the courtroom, alone and unnoticed, while the bailiff idly scrolled through his phone during the recess. For 15 long years, Leonard had lived unseen, lost to the very system he once served. After Evelyn's death, Leonard's grief plunged him into darkness, compounded by untreated PTSD. The VA hospital's misdiagnosis of her cancer had shattered his trust in the system. When she passed away, Leonard retreated from life itself, abandoning his benefits, his pension, and his own identity. He could no longer bear to engage with the bureaucracy that had failed the woman he cherished. Over time, locals saw him as a mere nuisance. Teenagers hurled scraps of food at him. Shop owners hosed down sidewalks where he tried to sleep. The police moved him along when residents complained. Even among other homeless individuals, Leonard became isolated, often waking from night terrors that kept everyone at a distance. Leonard managed to survive by collecting bottles and cans, scraping together just enough to buy cough syrup during the brutal winters. He never begged, never asked for help. His military discipline had ingrained a sense of pride and resilience that clung to him even as his circumstances crumbled. On the worst nights, Leonard would pull out the photo of Evelyn, carefully wrapped in plastic against the elements. "Almost there, Evie," he would whisper, holding on to the last thread of hope. Meanwhile, in his chambers, Judge Whitaker made a series of urgent calls. First to the VA, demanding immediate confirmation of Leonard's service history. Then to Thomas Reed, now a colonel, who had once served alongside both men. "Reed, it's Sam Whitaker. I found him. The man who carried me out of Fallujah. He's sitting in my courtroom, homeless, facing theft charges." The heavy silence on the line spoke volumes before Reed finally answered. "I'm 3 hours out. Don't let him slip away." The judge grabbed official court letterhead and hastily scribbled a note. Leonard Hayes is not just another homeless man. He is a forgotten hero who stood loyal to a country that abandoned him. Although judicial ethics barred Whitaker from immediately dismissing the case due to personal ties, he was determined to ensure that the outcome would no longer follow the path that had been set. As the recess neared its end, the judge's clerk noticed a new document on his desk. The iconic photo of Leonard carrying the Afghan child, now accompanied by a handwritten message. Some heroes never sought recognition. The clerk recognized the handwriting. It was Colonel Reed's from previous correspondence on veteran affairs cases. The picture was becoming clearer. Leonard Hayes was no ordinary defendant. His actions had rippled through many lives, including those now tasked with judging his fate. When court reconvened, Leonard immediately sensed a shift in the room. Judge Whitaker's demeanor had softened, the cool detachment replaced by something Leonard couldn't quite name. Respect, perhaps, or maybe even reverence. Before Leonard could make sense of it all, the proceedings took a sharp and unexpected turn. In light of new evidence regarding the defendant's history, Judge Whitaker announced, this court will adjourn further proceedings. Awaiting a thorough investigation, Judge Whitaker announced that the defendant would remain in custody until the next day's hearing. The prosecutor looked momentarily puzzled, but raised no objections. Leonard, accustomed to systems deciding his fate without offering explanations, simply nodded. As Leonard was being escorted out, Judge Whitaker added, and ensure that Mr. Hayes receives a proper meal and medical attention. Later that night, a local news blog ran a skeptical headline, Homeless Man Claims to be War Hero, Judge Postpones Sentencing for Bread Theft. The comment section was quickly flooded with cynicism. Just another bum pretending to be a veteran. If he really served, why isn't the VA taking care of him instead of him stealing? At the county detention facility, Leonard encountered hostility from a younger inmate who had read the article on a smuggled phone. You're disgusting, old man, the inmate spat, shoving Leonard against a wall. My brother died in Afghanistan, while frauds like you wear the uniform for sympathy. Leonard didn't fight back. He absorbed the blow just as he had absorbed the cold indifference of society for years. That night, he refused the offered meal, clinging instead to his battered dog tags and the photo of Evelyn, wondering why, after so much time, someone had finally looked at him and truly seen him. Have you ever witnessed someone being misjudged purely based on appearances? Share this story. Someone might need to hear it. The next morning, Leonard was brought back to court, unaware that something extraordinary was unfolding. Unlike the near-empty gallery of the previous day, every seat was now occupied. News crews gathered outside the courthouse, barred from entering but eager to report what would soon happen. Leonard's confusion deepened when he noticed his court-appointed attorney had been replaced by a distinguished older man who introduced himself as Charles Hammond from the Veterans Legal Defense Alliance. Someone has taken a strong interest in your case, Mr. Hayes, Hammond explained, offering no further details. As Leonard sat silently at the defense table, he heard the large courtroom doors open. The gallery stood as Judge Whitaker entered, but Leonard's attention was pulled toward 3 military officers in formal dress uniforms following behind the judge. All rise for the Honorable Judge Samuel Whitaker, the bailiff called out. The hearing began with an unusual gravity. Judge Whitaker's demeanor was strikingly different from the day before. Before addressing the charges against Mr. Hayes, Judge Whitaker stated, this court will hear testimony relevant to the defendant's history, which could impact the outcome of these proceedings. Leonard watched in disbelief as Colonel Thomas Reed approached the witness stand. Though 20 years older than Leonard remembered, Reed's commanding military presence remained unmistakable. After being sworn in, Colonel Reed addressed the courtroom with firm clarity. I am Colonel Thomas Reed, currently stationed at Fort Hamilton. I have known Sergeant Leonard Hayes since our deployment to Iraq in 2003. The colonel turned to look directly at Leonard. This man sitting before you saved the lives of 17 soldiers when our convoy was ambushed near Fallujah. Under intense enemy fire, he drove a burning fuel truck away from our position, sustaining second-degree burns but preventing an explosion that would have killed us all. Gasps and murmurs rippled across the courtroom as Reed continued. Sergeant Hayes also carried a wounded medic, a young private named Samuel Whitaker. 2 miles to safety, despite suffering shrapnel wounds to his own leg. With those words, every gaze shifted to Judge Whitaker, whose mask of professional detachment cracked slightly as he gave a solemn nod of confirmation. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, while this testimony speaks highly of the defendant's past character, it does not change the fact that theft was committed. May I proceed with the charges? Before the judge could respond, Colonel Reed interjected. Upon reviewing Mr. Hayes' service record, we discovered a major administrative error. Due to a system transition in 2008, his pension and benefits were wrongfully terminated when vital documents were sent to an outdated address. He has been owed approximately $1,370 per month over the last 15 years, along with health care for service-related injuries, totaling over $246,000. The courtroom remained frozen as the full weight of the revelation sank in. Leonard himself appeared stunned, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the table tightly. Furthermore, Colonel Reed said, pulling out a folder, we have statements from 5 members of his former unit, each affirming his character and service. Included is a letter from General Donovan, crediting Sergeant Hayes with saving his son's life during the same ambush. Judge Whitaker turned and addressed Leonard directly for the first time. Mr. Hayes, please approach the bench. Leonard hesitated, unsure, until the judge continued. Under normal circumstances, protocol would prevent me from presiding over a case involving someone with whom I have a personal history. However, I did not recognize you yesterday. Only after reviewing your records did I realize you were the man who saved my life in Iraq. A gasp swept through the packed courtroom. The judge removed his glasses, his formal demeanor softening visibly. I spent nearly 20 years trying to find you, just to say thank you. I never knew your full name. All I heard that day was Hayes shouted through the chaos. Leonard's voice, when it finally emerged, was raspy from years of little use. I was just doing my duty, sir. You did far more than that, Judge Whitaker replied, his voice steady. And this country failed to do its duty for you. Turning toward the young prosecutor, Judge Whitaker asked, in light of these extraordinary revelations, does the state still wish to pursue the charges? Clearly moved, the prosecutor replied, Your Honor, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Hayes with prejudice. So ordered, Judge Whitaker said immediately. Mr. Hayes, you are free to go. This court extends its deepest apologies for the injustice that extended well beyond this courtroom. As Leonard stood there in stunned silence, the rear doors of the courtroom swung open once again. A woman in her early 30s entered, her eyes scanning anxiously until they found Leonard. Tears ran down her cheeks as she approached him. Uncle Leonard, she said softly, I'm Rachel, Evelyn's niece. We've been searching for you for years. Leonard's defenses finally crumbled. His shoulders sagged as Rachel embraced him. The first human touch he had known in years, that wasn't from officers handcuffing him. Outside the courthouse, reporters immediately surrounded Colonel Reed with cameras and microphones. This isn't just about one man, Reed declared firmly. It's about thousands of Leonard Hayes out there, lost in the cracks of the very system they once defended. That afternoon, the story spread across the nation. News helicopters hovered over the courthouse as Leonard, freshly shaved and wearing donated clothing, emerged flanked by Colonel Reed and Judge Whitaker, who had officially recused himself but stayed as a private citizen. Mr. Parker, the store owner, who had initially pressed charges, pushed his way through the crowd to reach Leonard. I didn't know, he said, his voice thick with shame. I judged you like everyone else. I'm so sorry. Leonard simply nodded, too overwhelmed for words. Within 2 days, a veteran support organization established a fund for Leonard, quickly raising over $200,000. Social media was flooded with stories of other veterans abandoned by bureaucratic failures, prompting the VA to announce a national review of canceled benefits cases. In a quiet moment away from cameras and microphones, Judge Whitaker finally spoke the words he had waited decades to say. You carried me 2 miles with shrapnel tearing your leg apart, he said in a low voice. Doctors told me you refused treatment until I was stabilized. Leonard gave a slight shrug. You needed it more than I did. You said something to me that day, Whitaker continued, emotion thick in his throat. When I was drifting in and out, you told me, keep breathing, kid. Your story's not over. Those words kept me alive. They kept me fighting. I became a judge because I wanted to keep serving, he added. The way you served. Leonard looked at him, no longer seeing a judge in robes, but the terrified young medic he had once carried through enemy fire. I'm just glad something good came from that day, Leonard said simply. Not just something good, Judge Whitaker answered. Everything good in my life since then. My family, my career, my purpose. It all exists because you didn't leave me behind. For the first time in many years, Leonard smiled. It was a true smile, one that reached his tired eyes. No one left behind, Leonard said. That was never just a slogan to me. 3 days later, Leonard stood proudly in the judge's chambers, dressed in a brand new suit. His military medals, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, and others, were pinned proudly to his chest. A representative from the Department of Veterans Affairs handed him a formal settlement check, compensating him for years of lost benefits due to administrative error. As news cameras flashed, Leonard spoke to the public for the first time. I don't want pity, he said with quiet strength. I just hope that the ones who come after me won't be forgotten the way I was. The story evolved from a simple local interest piece into a national movement questioning how America treats its veterans. Legislators cited Leonard's ordeal as they introduced new reforms for the benefit system. The image of Leonard carrying the wounded Afghan child resurfaced, now placed side by side with photos of him homeless on Brooklyn streets. A powerful contrast that stirred difficult but necessary questions about the country's priorities. Leonard Hayes, who had been invisible for 15 years, had finally become a figure no one could ignore. When have you seen justice arrive late, but just in time to make a difference? Share your story. You might inspire hope in someone else. 6 months later, Leonard moved into Veterans Village, an assisted living community in Brooklyn. His modest apartment, the first place he could truly call home since Evelyn's passing, held few possessions, but proudly displayed a wall filled with photographs. On the wall of Leonard's modest apartment hung several photographs: Evelyn on their wedding day, his old unit during deployment in Iraq, and a new image of him standing alongside Judge Whitaker at a veterans recognition ceremony. Leonard politely declined most requests for interviews, but agreed to speak at local schools about military service and the struggles veterans often face upon returning home. His calm dignity and direct way of speaking resonated especially with troubled teenagers, who saw in him neither judgment nor pity, only sincere stories of courage and hardship. Each afternoon, Leonard could often be found sitting quietly on a bench at Prospect Park, watching children play. Sometimes at the very same bench where he used to sleep when harsh weather forced him away from his usual shelters. Outside the courthouse in Brooklyn, a new bronze plaque was installed. It bore a simple yet powerful inscription: "Justice is remembering those who once stood forgotten." Beside the inscription, a relief sculpture depicted Leonard carrying the wounded medic who would one day become Judge Whitaker, with the American flag waving softly in the background. At the dedication ceremony, the mayor announced the establishment of an annual fund to provide legal support specifically for homeless veterans, to be known as the Hayes Initiative. A 10-year-old boy who had once seen Leonard collecting bottles wrote an essay for his school paper. Not everyone in torn clothes is bad. Some people wear memories instead. The heartfelt essay won a citywide competition and was later read aloud during a city council session focused on homelessness reforms. Leonard maintained a close friendship with Judge Whitaker, sometimes joining the judge's family for Sunday dinners. During one of these meals, the judge's young son asked Leonard if he felt bitterness about having been homeless for so long. Leonard thought carefully before replying, "I don't need anyone's pity. I just hope those who come after me will remember those who came before." On Veterans Day, Leonard stood proudly before a large crowd at Fort Hamilton, wearing his dress uniform for the first time in decades. When invited to speak, he kept his words brief but impactful. "I once served to protect this nation. Now this nation has protected me in return." His voice gained strength as he continued, "Kindness is never too late. It only requires someone patient enough to deliver it." As he stepped away from the podium, the gathered military personnel, from the youngest recruits to seasoned veterans, rose in a unified, silent salute. Leonard straightened his back and returned the salute. His clear, steady gaze no longer faced downward in shame, but looked ahead, toward the future. Justice may sometimes delay, but it never truly fails to arrive. Never give up when you are standing for what is right. When have you stood firm even when everything seemed against you? Share your story now. Subscribe to QH Incredible Stories to see truth and justice triumph. Share this message with someone who needs faith to keep walking the right path. Your Honor, the defendant was caught stealing a loaf of bread from a local grocery. The prosecutor had said coldly. The man had simply bowed his head. I just needed the strength to survive one more day, he had answered. The courtroom laughed, but the judge did not. He had just heard the man's name. Who was he? And why had the judge's eyes suddenly filled with tears?